Hey, thanks everyone for tuning in. And Anthony Lewis has joined me again this time to talk about the house divisions in astrology. Thanks, Anthony, for joining. It's a pleasure having you again.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so house divisions is not kind of explored by most of them, at least the mathematical and astronomical rationale. We are not going to delve deep into anything, but I think we'll just cover the basics of what house divisions are and how things work. So, coming from India, we are always used to the whole sign houses, and I'm not used to various other quadrant house systems, and it's difficult for us to kind of think houses are not equal to signs. So, it becomes a bit tricky for me, at least due to my background. But I think it's interesting to explore how things once I started learning Western astrology, it's kind of getting. I mean, I won't say I'm completely out of it, but I kind of use it here and there, especially when it comes to horary astrology. And in public or social media forums, we see people mostly posting Placidus charts, and we have to. I don't want to kind of change it, and I just try to see there and put my inputs there. So I'm kind of slowly getting used to using the quadrant houses, especially in horary astrology, but not necessarily natal astrology. So, but that's interpretive side of it. But coming back to our own topic here, we're going to deal with the rationale of how it works. Various house divisions work. So I think it's up to you now.
Okay. So what I did was I put together a bunch of slides. I've never given this talk before, so this is new. And I've tried to be historically accurate as much as possible. But there's certain things I think we don't know about, or at least I don't know about, so I have to guess at what astrologers a couple thousand years ago may have been thinking. And I'll try to identify when I'm speculating and when I'm not.
Okay.
And so the issue of house divisions, I think in both Western and in Indian astrology, early on, we did use the whole signs. And they weren't called houses, they were called places.
Yeah.
And the idea was that at the moment of birth, the ascendant, which was the point of the ecliptic, the path of the sun, that was coming up on the horizon, would be in a certain sign. And so that sign came in first place, like in a horse race.
Mm.
And then the sign after it was in the second place, the sign after it was in the third place, all around to the 12th place. And then astrologers noticed that these places seem to have significance for certain areas of the life. So the first place seemed to represent the individual, the body, the health, and so on of the individual. The second place might be the resources, the income, and so on.
Yeah.
The third place, the siblings. The fourth place, the parents. The fifth place, the children, and so on. The sixth place, the illnesses, all around, way around the wheel. And so what we now call houses were kind of placeholders for topics.
Sure.
And the Greek word for what we call houses was topos, or topoi, which means a place from which we get the word topic. So the topoi, which were the places, were symbols of the topics of life that segment represented. And when I get into the slides, this will become a little clearer.
Sure.
And I think the other issue is that astrologers, especially nowadays, many learn astrology without learning the basic astronomy or the basic math that goes into putting a chart together, and tend to work in two dimensions, like on a piece of paper with a chart drawn. But in reality, we exist in 3 spatial dimensions and a time dimension. We exist in 4 dimensions at least, and maybe more.
Yeah.
But 4 obvious dimensions. And so I have a prop. I made a prop. This is the celestial sphere.
Oh,
And I want to show you what the houses look like. So this sphere could be anything. There are two poles. There's a North Pole and a South Pole, and there's an equator.
sure.
So if we align this with the Earth, the equator is the equator of the Earth. If we make the center of this the ecliptic, the path of the sun, the equator is the ecliptic, and the poles are the poles of the ecliptic.
Sure.
So let's imagine that for a second. So let's imagine that the equator of this orange is the ecliptic, the path of the sun. And then the whole sign houses, well, here's 6 of them.
I mean, yeah,
So here's a house.
sure.
And if we align it with the zodiac, it's sort of a wedge-shaped, I think in astronomy, they call these lunes, like lunar segments, because they're sort of shaped like the moon. But as you can see, the house looks like this in space. You can imagine this in the whole celestial sphere. It's this kind of wedge or loon that has an axis in the middle and then spreads out and encompasses a certain segment of space.
Sure.
And I think the initial idea that astrologers had was that because we deal with 12 signs, there are 12 houses, and they should all be of the same shape. They should all contain the same amount of space.
Okay.
And so there should be 12 of these.
That's basically whole signs.
I just ate the first house.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're entitled to. So basically, if you don't know, or if you find it very difficult to kind of digest the rationale of whole sign houses, I think you can just peel up an orange and see how it works.
Right. But if the midline of this is the ecliptic, then planets can be, they're near the ecliptic, but stars could be way out here, way out here.
Yeah.
And depending on how you define the house, that segment of space will fall into that house. But if you say I have a star over here that falls in this house, but suppose I tilt the orientation of this, then the star may no longer fall in this house. It may fall in another house.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And that's where the quadrant houses sort of are different than the whole sign houses. I'll finish eating my orange later. So that's one point. Just visually, I think we need to think of the houses as these 3-dimensional segments of the universe, basically, centered at the center of the Earth where we draw our charts from. And they encompass this huge area in this wedge-shaped 3-dimensional form. So that's what the houses look like.
That's very smart.
All right, so let me go to my slides. Share screen. Oh, you have to enable sharing.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so when you enable sharing, I'll go to the slides. So tell me when you've done that.
Yeah, I just did it.
Okay, share screen, slides. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
All right, and I'm going to enlarge them. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is an old diagram. This is from I think Sibley's book.
Yeah, sure.
Houses were drawn in different forms. This is called a square chart, and each of these segments is a house. I think there's an Indian form of the chart that looks a lot like this, right?
Yeah, but not entirely, yes.
Not entirely. There's a Persian form that looks very similar.
Yes.
That's irrelevant. We can draw houses. This is a 2-dimensional diagram of 3-dimensional space, a segment of 3-dimensional space. So what I decided to do for this talk today was look at a specific chart so that we're always referring back to a specific chart. And what I chose was we're in the month of June, and the sun will make a solstice, meaning it will stop at the Tropic of Cancer and change direction, go from north to south on June 21st. So I went to Stellarium and I created this image of June 21st, the day of the solstice, at sunrise in New York City, because I live near New York, so I picked New York. Could be anywhere in the world. So if on June 21st, I'm in New York and I go to a park or the top of a building and I look due south, this is what I'm going to see. Over to my left, which will be to the east because I'm facing south, the sun will be just rising at about 5:30 in the morning. And the sun is very bright, so if there's stars around it, we really can't see them, or planets. They're combust, we say, the sun. But then as we go up from the horizon, and here's east, here's south, so the sun is really rising north of east. And that occurs because the path of the sun is tilted with respect to the equator of the Earth about 23.5 degrees. And we're at a latitude of New York, which is like 40, 41 north. So this yellow line is the ecliptic. This is the path the sun takes during the day. So it rises in the east, culminates sort of in the south here, and sets over here in the west, or really the southwest in New York. So as we go up, we see Venus. Venus is a nice bright star there near the eye of the bull, Aldebaran. This is the bull, constellation of the bull. Now, notice I said constellation, not sign, because signs and the constellations are not identical. But if we looked at the sky and we looked at the actual constellation, Venus would be right near the eye of the constellation of the bull. And the other thing to notice is that the bull is a pretty big constellation. It occupies a huge portion of space here. After the bull, we come into the ram. The ram is a lot smaller than the bull. He occupies a lot less space. So the sizes of the constellations are not uniform. Some are very big and some are very small and some are middle range. And here's Uranus near the horns of the ram here on the ecliptic. I should say Venus is below the ecliptic, so it has we call a latitude south of the celestial latitude south of the ecliptic. All the visible planets travel near the ecliptic, sometimes on it, usually just near it, usually within 8 degrees below or 8 degrees above. That's sort of the range. And that's why the ecliptic became so important in astrology, because the planets all travel near the ecliptic. As we go up, so here's the ram, and then we come to the fish. Here's one fish, here's the other fish. Well, the fish occupy an enormous portion of the heavens. So here's a bull, a big bull, moderate-sized ram, huge fish. And toward the beginning of the fish is the planet Mars, also south of the ecliptic, below the ecliptic, in the constellation of the fish. And this point here is marked with the Aries symbol. And this represents the equinox. That's just a symbol of that's where the equator crosses the ecliptic. It marks in the north the first day of spring, and in the south the first day of autumn. So that's the zero Aries point, or the vernal point. And as we go along the ecliptic now, we're not yet at the meridian, which is where the
culmination.
That's the line that's due south from where you live. If you draw a line from the North Pole to the South Pole through your location, that's your meridian. It identifies where you are on Earth. And where the meridian crosses the ecliptic, we call the midheaven in astrology. Okay? If I say something confusing or not clear, just ask me to repeat it.
No, so far it's good.
So this point is the midheaven. And it's important to note that from our vantage point in New York, the highest point is not the midheaven. The highest point on the ecliptic is not the midheaven, which is interesting. A lot of astrologers don't realize this. even though
Yeah.
it's written about in the literature.
Yeah, I
The
think we had
midheaven,
a chat about it.
mhm.
Mm.
Right, you and I did, we didn't record it.
Yes.
And the midheaven here is in the constellation of the water carrier, the water bearer,
Mm.
which is also a pretty big sign.
Yeah.
The arm of this water bearer overlaps with this, the sea goat, or you would call him the crocodile,
Ah. Makara. Ah.
which is a moderate sign about the size of the ram here.
Sure.
Sign, I mean, constellation.
Mm.
And between the crocodile, the sea goat, and this is the archer, we have Saturn and Jupiter. Saturn might be just in this constellation.
Sure.
Jupiter's still in the archer. They're very close. And we know they're in a conjoin this year. It's one of these
Yeah. Yeah.
important conjunctions. And they're about to set. Right? They're way in the west. As the sun rises, all of this will shift. The sky will appear to turn, and Jupiter and Saturn will go down below the horizon. And the sun and what's down here will come above the horizon.
Mm.
And so the ancient astrologers, this is what they would look at. They'd look at the sky and they'd know the path of the sun. You know, the Babylonians who were well aware of the ecliptic, they could measure. They actually had a coordinate system that measured along the ecliptic. And somehow they had to divide the ecliptic into spaces they could work with. Now, I have a slide about this later, but in Babylonian mathematics, going back maybe to 2000 BC, they were, at least then, they were using what we call sexagesimal or base 60 number system. We use a base 10. Everything is in our system is a multiple or expressed in powers of 10.
Mm.
They used 60 as their base. And as a result, they viewed a complete circle as having 360 degrees.
Sure.
And if they divided the circle up, they would divide it into 12 parts of 30 degrees each. And I think the fact that they were using the base 60 system accounts for why we have 12 signs.
Yeah. Could be. Yeah. Sure.
And the circle, being a mathematical structure, has exactly 360 units called degrees. And 12 of those, 12 times 30 is 360. And I think they must have patterned, this is my guess, patterned that idea of dividing into 12 by the number of lunations in the year. That is the number of new moons or full moons in the year, which was typically about, in a typical solar year, there are 12 new moons or 12 full moons. It's not exact, but it's very close. And if you idealize from nature to a mathematical model, then you divide the circle in 12 parts, which correspond to the 12 months of the year. So this is my hunch. My guess is that they were constructing, the Babylonians and the Greeks after them were constructing a mathematical model of the universe that they could use in their astronomy, their astrology, their daily work. And to do so, they idealized or abstracted from nature to make a model that was close to nature, but not precisely exactly the same. Okay. Anything else about this? Because we're going to keep going back to this chart and this diagram and see how it's divided up in the different systems.
Sure. I think so far it's fine. We'll just move on and see how it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I want to say about the meridian, which is the line of longitude of your location on Earth, where it crosses the ecliptic, which we call the midheaven or the medium Caeli. Knowing that that was such an important point geometrically, astronomically, astrologers studied it and came to realize in charts that it was a very powerful point. That something on this point, this MC point, had a lot to do with the person's actions in the world, the profession they followed, their ability to get things done, their fame, their reputation. So even though it wasn't the highest point on the ecliptic at the time somebody was born, it was a very, very significant and powerful point. And so I think that became the origin of the shift from whole signs to quadrant houses.
Okay.
Because everybody thought the ascendant was extremely important, all astrologers. And then they came to realize there's a second extremely important point, nearly as powerful as the ascendant, which is not the sort of geometrical midpoint of the place you were born, but is where the meridian crosses the ecliptic. And that it acts very much like the 10th house in its symbolism.
Sure.
So then you had the choice, well, how do we reconcile the fact that there's a point whose symbolism is very much like the 10th house symbolism, but which is not necessarily the whole sign 10th house. In fact, maybe in a different sign completely.
Mm.
So there's this discrepancy in how do you make sense of it. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So we're going to be going over this arrangement repeatedly.
Okay.
So just to go through a little geometry, astronomy.
Cool.
This is a globe. We've all seen these. The globe has a north pole and a south pole. This line here is the ecliptic, the path of the sun, and it crosses the equator. It crosses the equator at the equinoxes, which are 0 Libra, 0 Aries in the tropical zodiac.
Okay.
All right. We talk about great circles. These are circles on the earth or on the celestial sphere. The center of the circle is the center of the sphere. That's what makes it a great circle. And the important ones in astrology, some of them are the ecliptic, the path of the sun, because we're geocentric, we're watching the sun go by.
Yeah, sure.
The equator, which we all know, I think, what it is.
Mm.
The horizon, which is a local thing. Our point on Earth determines the horizon. It's in the celestials, it's measured from the center of the Earth outward, not from the surface of the Earth. But it's kind of the plane of the circle that we're standing on. We're perpendicular to our horizon.
Mm.
Okay. And above our head is our zenith, below our feet is our nadir. And if we wave our arms like this to the sides, east and west, we draw a circle which we call the prime vertical. That's the next one.
Perfect.
So the prime vertical is a circle that goes to the top of our head, the bottom of our feet, left and right of us, east and west, as we're facing due south toward the equator.
Sure.
And the prime vertical meets the horizon in the east and the west, or the east and west points, and our meridian meets the horizon in the north and south, what we call the north and south points of the horizon.
Mm.
Okay. And this is just another visualization of what we're talking about. So in astronomy and astrology, the Earth is projected onto what's called the celestial sphere. So this contains the entire universe. There's a North Pole and a South Pole, which are the axis of the Earth extended outward. There is the path of here's the sun, the path of the sun, this is it, which is tilted 23.5 degrees with respect to the equator. There's the 23.5 degrees.
Yeah.
And the horizon depends on where we are standing on Earth. The meridian comes from the Latin word meridies, meaning the midday, the middle of the day. It's where the sun is at midday.
Mm.
And so here's a person. Here we put him in the middle of the Earth. And directly above his head is the zenith. Directly below his feet is his nadir. Due south, so along the meridian, where the horizon meets the meridian, will be the south point of the horizon. Whoops, let me go back. Due north of him will be the north point of the horizon. Due east will be the east point of the horizon. West, the west point of the horizon. these become important for dividing the sphere into houses, quadrant houses, because many systems will draw a great circle through the north and south points of the horizon that to divide the whole sphere into those wedges, these wedges. Okay. This says, I'm not going to repeat this, just another picture of the same thing.
Yeah.
And this is this, let me go over this one, it's the same thing, but here is the green is the horizon. That's where you're standing.
Mm.
Where the ecliptic comes up over the horizon is the ascendant of your chart. Where the ecliptic, the opposite point is the descendant. The point of the ecliptic that's going below the horizon is your descendant. Your horizon has a west and an east point determined by the prime vertical, and a north and a south point determined by the meridian of where you live.
Yeah.
And when a lot of the house systems said we'll draw great circles from north to south on the horizon, dividing one of these other circles, like the prime vertical or the equator, into equal portions, and that will give us these wedge-shaped houses. Was that clear or not?
Yeah, sure. Perfect.
Okay, good. Because that's a fundamental thing to realize, that a lot of the house systems draw great circles through the north and south points, but dividing the various other great circles into equal 30-degree segments.
Mm.
The history of house, these are the common house systems up to the 17th century. I didn't want to include everything known to, because there's so many different house systems.
Sure, yeah.
But most house systems are variations on these themes. So the first one that we think is the whole sign place system, in which the ascendant defines the first place. And then all the other places are just the order of the zodiac, starting at the ascendant. So if you're born with, say, Cancer rising, your first place is Cancer.
Mm.
Your second place is Leo, and so on. Now, Ptolemy, his book, he appears to be using equal houses or equal places, but instead of using whole signs, there's one section where he says, let's consider the houses to start 5 degrees before the ascendant degree, and then to go in equal 30-degree segments. So this is a form of an equal house system, which is very similar to the whole sign, except the starting point is different.
Sure.
And so it seems like initially the Greeks were thinking houses had to be equal 30-degree segments. And the only thing that would differ is where you started. You start at the beginning of the sign or somewhere within the sign, and then measure 30 degrees from there.
Okay, but I think some form of Indian house division uses the middle point as a starting point.
Right, there is that.
Yeah.
That's right. I've seen that one. They use the midpoint, but again, it's every 30 degrees is a new midpoint. So they're equal houses.
Yes.
The midpoint being the cusp.
Yes.
Yeah. And then Porphyry, what we call it Porphyry Houses. He was in the 3rd century, but there's evidence of its use in Valens in the 2nd century. Had the idea, remember we said the astrologers began to notice that the midheaven point, where the meridian crosses the ecliptic, was very powerful and seemed to represent 10th house issues, even if it didn't fall in the 10th sign.
Sure.
And so they got this idea that maybe we need to be dividing the quadrants starting at the ascendant, but the other division would be the meridian. The meridian would divide the middle of the circle. And so we had to start the 10th house at the MC, the first house at the ascendant, and divide that quadrant into 3 equal parts. And so he just divided by 3, which is, it's a nice arithmetic division of the ecliptic.
Sure.
The problem with it is that when you do that, these segments then are all different sizes. They're not uniform. And so some astrologers objected to that, saying, well, then some houses are bigger than others. Some houses encompass very large areas of space, others very small areas of space. Theoretically, is that justifiable? Although there are many astrologers who use the Porphyry system, who did use it historically and who use it today, who say it works just fine. So in practice, it seems to be fine.
Sure.
Theoretically, there are some objections. And so astrologers began, I think there was a period where astrologers were using both the whole signs and the quadrants, houses, and mixing them. They would sometimes refer to whole signs, then if they wanted to make another point, refer to quadrant houses. Or the other thing the earlier astrologers did was they used the whole signs for topics. Like if the fifth house was your children, the fifth sign would be children. But they would use the quadrant houses for
strength,
how significant or important or powerful a planet was. So if a planet fell near the midheaven point, the MC, it was very powerful, even if the MC was in the ninth house or the eighth house. So that they would make that distinction between what topic does it represent, meaning the whole sign, and how powerful is the planet, meaning the quadrant house. But eventually, astrologers began to use quadrant houses for topics as well, not just the strength of the planet, but what does the planet signify in that region of the zodiac.
Sure.
And eventually whole signs kind of dropped out. Not entirely, because I think I've written about and talked about before, Marinus has an example where he uses both quadrant houses and whole sign houses to interpret a chart. So now Alcabitius had this idea, and again, he probably didn't originate it because there's evidence of the same idea in Rhetorius from the 5th century, that it's a little too simplistic just to divide the span on the ecliptic by 3. What if instead of dividing the arc on the ecliptic by 3, let's measure the time it takes for the ascendant degree or the sun when it rises to reach the midheaven. Then if that's, say, 6 hours, each house should be 2 hours in length.
Sure.
If it's 9 hours, each house will be 3 hours in length. So he's dividing time, the time it takes for a degree at the horizon to rise and reach the midheaven, which was called the culmination point.
Sure.
And dividing that time by 3. Now, the problem with that is that it's a similar rationale as the Porphyry system. Porphyry is dividing an arc along the ecliptic into 3 equal segments. Alcabitius is dividing a time into 3 equal segments, but he's ignoring the fact that different signs rise at different rates. So that again, you're not getting exactly equal portions of space or space-time.
So basically, it's about quadrant houses are about dividing the spaces or by time. So these are the two ways. Yeah,
well,
either
divide
space, time.
You can divide time. And then Placidus finally came along and said, let's divide space-time the way Einstein thought of it.
Yeah,
sort of.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's the ultimate point that we are getting at. So
yeah, but Alcabitius became the dominant house system for hundreds of years in the
Islamic
late
golden
Hellenistic
age
and medieval period. It was everybody used it. It was the standard that everybody used for centuries. Then Campanus is the next major house system. This is also found in Al-Biruni, so it wasn't new to Campanus. And he had this idea, trying to rectify the fact that these earlier house systems didn't create equal segments. how can we get equal segments that make sense? And he said, well, let's divide the prime vertical, which is the circle we stand in that's around us, into equal 30-degree segments. And let's draw lines from the north and south points of the horizon through those boundaries. And wherever they cut the ecliptic, those are houses. And we're standing in the midst. So Campana you'd be standing in the midst of, right in the middle of all these equal segments in your prime vertical. And wherever the ecliptic cut them would be the cusps of the ecliptic houses. But all of the segments would be equal because you're cutting your prime vertical into equal wedges here. That makes sense?
Okay. Can you just repeat Campanus?
Yeah.
Okay.
Campana said, let's cut the prime vertical. Maybe I should go back to the prime vertical diagram. Is this it?
Yeah.
I had a better one. Is this? Well, here, okay.
Yeah, I think this works. Yeah.
This is the prime vertical in the middle. The person's standing here and facing south. If he stretches his arms out, they'll face east and west. Above him is zenith, below him is his nadir.
Yeah.
So this circle you're standing in. And Campana said, let's divide this circle into equal 30-degree segments. So we're standing in the midst of these wedges like this.
Right.
And all around us, above and below,
sure,
there's a wedge like this. And we're going to take, let's say this is the boundary of the house that goes from the zenith to this point. We're going to take a circle that goes from the north through here to the south. And this circle, this will be one edge of it. This will be the other edge of it. And this area will be a
divisions of
house.
Sure.
And that will cross through the ecliptic, and wherever it does will give us the boundary of the Campana's ecliptic houses.
Okay.
But the nice thing Campana said is, we know because we're standing in the middle of them, everywhere we look, we see an equal house around us. And so we know we're in the midst of these equal houses, right in the middle. We're standing in the middle of this orange. And above me, there's a wedge. Over here, there's a wedge. They're all equal-sized wedges.
Sure.
And he was very happy with that idea that finally we have a house system that's going to divide space, the space around the individual at his birth, into 12 equal segments of space. Wedges of space, orange slices of space. And that was a very appealing idea because it preserved the whole sign concept that each whole sign of 30 degrees, they're all of equal size, is a house, and you don't have big ones and little ones, which other systems had. So that was Campanus. Regiomontanus came along and said, that's a really good idea. I like Campanus. I like equal sized houses. But in reality, if we study especially mundane astrology, world events, the problem he saw with Campanus was it's focused on the location of the individual. And some peasant born in, I don't know, Afghanistan is not going to affect world history, probably. But what really affects world history is the rotation of the Earth on its axis and the spin of the equator, which is always west to east. And so wouldn't it be better as a more general universal system to take the equator and divide it into equal 30-degree segments and do exactly what Campanus did, but instead of centering everything on the location of the individual and his prime vertical, let's center it on the center of the Earth and the Earth's equator. And that gives us a more universal system that's much better for world events. And so in the Regiomontanus system, you take the equator, you draw those same lines from the north and south point of the horizon to make the equal wedges. But here, if you're standing in the center of the Earth, and I guess your horizon, I guess you'd be standing in the North Pole if your horizon was the equator. You'd have these very nice equal segments of space whose North Pole would be the North Pole of the Earth, South Pole, the South Pole of the Earth, whose equator would be the equator of the Earth, whose horizon would be the equator. And they would all be of equal segments, but they'd be more vertical like this than this way for Campanus. And so Regiomontanus caught on. The other reason he caught on was Ptolemy at this time in history had become very popular in Europe. And Regiomontanus claimed that he was simply dividing space the way Ptolemy implied it should be divided in his Tetrabiblos. And so Regiomontanus, and the printing press had been invented then, so he printed tables, he had a rationale, and he claimed to be teaching what Ptolemy really meant. And so this became the dominant system of 15th, 16th century Europe.
Yeah, sure. I think you had this conversation in detail with Chris Brennan.
Chris Brennan,
yeah, sure.
And then Placidus came along and popularized a system which Ibn Ezra had discussed in the 12th century, based on his reading of Ptolemy, that, well, actually what Ptolemy was really saying was not to divide the equator equally and to use these lines, these great circles from the north and south point of the horizon to divide the house wedges. But he was talking about space-time. And that's a little complex, but maybe we'll get into a little. And so then Ptolemy caught on after Regiomontanus because the British astrologers thought he was just brilliant and popularized him at the end of the 17th and through the 18th, 19th centuries. By the 19th century, he was the dominant house system in the English-speaking world because his ideas were so popular. And so the tables they printed were all Ptolemaic tables. They got rid of the Regiomontanus ones. And Ptolemy became the dominant system since then, since the late 17th century in the English-speaking world. And then in the modern times, there's a lot more different house systems, but I think these are the basic concepts. All right. So Mashallah just used whole signs as his basic system, but also used quadrant houses, either Porphyry or Alcabitius. If you read Mashallah, Mashallah, there's a book I have by Kennedy and Pingree where they translate a text by Mashallah on Monday in astrology. And in it, he talks about houses by counting or houses by numbering, which are the whole sign houses. You identify the first house, then number the rest. And he contrasts those with houses by division, where you take the quadrant formed by the horizon and the meridian and divide it into portions based on some theoretical formula. So Mashallah is using both houses. He gives them different names. Whole sign houses that you count or number, and quadrant houses, houses that you divide the quadrants up into.
Cool.
And that book was published, I think, in 1977. So the idea of whole sign houses goes back at least to the 70s.
Sure.
There may be references earlier, but that was a very clear reference to the whole sign numbering.
Okay.
In the late 70s, in English anyway. So here's the same sky we looked at. Here I took out the constellation images to make it a little easier to see.
Okay.
And so the sun rose roughly at 5:30 in the morning, or will rise because we haven't gotten there yet. It will culminate at the MC at 12:57. So it's going to take 7 hours and 27 minutes to get from the horizon to the midheaven, the sun. And then it will set at 8:23, another 7 hours and 27 minutes later. Now, what's striking about this figure is for the sun to go from here to here is the same amount of time as for the sun to go to here to here.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Sure. Yeah.
in astrology, we talk about signs of long ascension and short ascension. So some signs take a long time to rise,
And
and some
sometimes.
signs rise very quickly. And this was kind of the problem, a problem with Alcavicius, that he just divided the time here into thirds,
Equally. Yeah. Sure.
and they don't really produce equal segments. And then there's this concept of planetary hours, which goes way back in history, where you take the length of the day. There being 24 planetary hours in a day, 12 daylight hours and 12 nighttime hours. And so here's the daytime. And the daytime goes 727 plus 727 is what? 1456, right? Is that right? 7 and 7 is 14. 727 is 50. 7 is 54.
No, yeah,
right?
it's 50, yeah, yes, 54.
So the length of the day in New York City, day meaning how much daylight there will be, will be 14 hours and 54 minutes. And you take the 14 hours, 54 minutes, divide it by 12, because there's 12 hours in the day. And so each daytime hour lasts about 1 hour and 14.5 minutes on the clock.
Okay.
All these the planetary hours. So I think that's significant, because planetary hours become significant in Placidus. The idea Placidus had was that because of different ascensional times, let's let each house, there's 3 houses between the horizon and the midheaven. Let's let each house be 2 planetary hours. So the sun will rise from here to roughly here in 2 hours and 29 minutes.
Yeah.
And during the next 2 hours and 29 minutes, they'll go from here to here. And during the next 2 hours and 29 minutes from here to here. And each of those houses will be roughly equivalent amounts of space-time.
Okay.
Because it takes rising times into account.
Okay.
So he's trisecting the semi-arc. This is called the semi-arc. From the horizon to the midheavens, the semi-arc. Now, the other important, I mentioned this before, point to notice is the midheaven at the time the sun rose, so say this is a birth chart, is not the highest point in the sky. The highest point in the sky is something called the NonAdjustable. The NonAdjustable meaning 90, like sexagesimal refers to 60, NonAdjustable refers to 90. The point that's 90 degrees along the ecliptic from the horizon, so it's somewhere over here maybe, which will be also 90 degrees from the descendant.
Descendant, yes.
This is 180 degrees. So the point that's the midpoint between the horizon and the descendant in space, not in time. So the midheaven is kind of the midpoint in time. This is where the sun is at midday. It's a time midpoint. The MC is a midpoint in time. The NonAdjustable, the actual highest physical point in the sky on the ecliptic, is the NonAdjustable, the midpoint in space. So again, we have this distinction between space and time and what's highest and what's most significant.
Okay.
Am I being clear or not?
Yeah, absolutely. We had this conversation before, so it's even more.
Yeah, you and I did privately, I think, not on the tape.
Yes.
And so, but again, if you're using whole signs, you're really looking just at space. You're dividing the ecliptic spatially into 30-degree segments. And so the NonAdjustable will always be in the 10th house, because the 10th house, whole sign house, is always 90 degrees
away
from the ascendant.
Yeah.
And so the the 10th sign is always going to have this 90-degree relationship to the ascendant sign in whole signs.
Okay.
But the midheaven, because it's a midpoint in time and not space, could be way over here. This might be the 9th or 8th house.
Yeah, sure.
Or in a different time of year, it could be over in the 11th or 12th
11th.
house,
Yeah.
depending on how fast signs are rising.
Sure. Yeah.
And so this became a dilemma for these older astrologers. What's more important, or are they both equally significant? Do we use a house system where the highest point, the NonAdjustable, is the midheaven or has a significance of the midheaven? Or do we use the midpoint in space where the sun is at midday, clearly at midday, the sun is the most powerful point in the sky? And I think I have a chart later where I can show you the difference. And so this became a dilemma for astrologers. How do we interpret these different points? It's like there's almost two midheavens, the spatial midheaven and the time midheaven. And how do we distinguish them? And what is one more important than the other? Are they equally important? And the whole sign system regards the NonAdjustable, the spatial midpoint, as the most significant, whereas the quadrant house system says that the midpoint in time is the most important. And again, we're not talking about space-time, we're talking about either space or time. So these are interesting theoretical questions. And just in terms of planetary hours, 2 hours and 20, what do we say, 29
minutes.
9 minutes later, the sun will be here. 2 hours and 20 minutes later, the sun will be here. And then 2 hours and 20 minutes later, it'll set. So this is a very small portion of space, but it's a big portion of time.
Sure, yeah.
And so the houses here will be different. Okay, so this is the same chart. Here's the sun rising in New York, and we saw Venus here. This is tropical zodiac. I could have done this in sidereal, but I decided to use tropical because that's what I generally use.
Sure.
Here is Mars, very close to the NonAdjustable. This is the whole signs. The NonAdjustable, the ascendant is 0, Cancer 28. So the point 90 degrees away from the ascendant is 0, Aries 28. This is the NonAdjustable. So Mars is the highest planet in this chart. The midheaven is over here toward the beginning of the 9th house. Jupiter, Saturn are here. So let's go back so you can see it. Sun is here, Venus is here, Venus is here. Mars is right over here, close to 0, Aries. This is a little distorted because, I know why. I had made the horizon horizontal to make it easier to see. In reality, the horizon is a circle that you see as you look out.
Yeah.
But the midheaven is clearly below Mars. Whoops, going this way. And then Jupiter and Saturn are going to set. They're maybe at the cusp of the 8th house, and they're going to set over here. All right. So this is a typical whole sign with tropical signs.
Sure.
And what did I say? The whole sign system is like a horse race with 12 horses. Each horse comes in a certain place in the race, or topos means place in Greek, and each place signifies a certain area of life. So the ascendant sign is just which horse comes in first.
Yeah.
Which sign comes in first. And then that determines where all the other horses come in. And so here we have Aquarius coming in 8th. So Aquarius isn't going to do so well because he's the 8th house there. Now, getting back to Babylon, I suspect that the reason we have 12 houses is that there are, in the synodic cycle of the moon takes about 29.53 days to make a complete cycle. And in one solar year, that occurs 12 times. Now, the Babylonians used a lunisolar calendar, so they would have either 29 or 30 days in a month, because sometimes it would be 29, sometimes 30. The average would be 29.5. And doing that, if they had these shorter months, the year could have 13 new or full moons. The Greeks, I think I already said this, the Babylonians used the base 60 number system. They divided the circle into 360 degrees. So the Greeks inherited this 360-degree circle from the Babylonians.
Okay.
The Babylonians were pretty smart people. They had all kinds of mathematics developed on their tablets. They used a Fourier analysis, a type of one, to compute an ephemeris. So they were fairly sophisticated.
Yeah.
And they had a coordinate system that based on the ecliptic, much as we do today with the measuring planets along the ecliptic. So this is what the Greeks inherited. You know, the Babylonians, roughly 1800 to 300 BC. And then Alexander the Great conquered the region and brought this knowledge back to Hellenistic Egypt.
Sure.
So the Egyptians got hold of it, and they were using in Egypt a different calendar. The Egyptian calendar had 12 months of 30 degrees in each month. The year was 360 days long, and then there were those extra 5.25 days that they called intercalary days. They weren't really part of the year. They were time to celebrate, like a long New Year's Eve celebration. Then they start the year again. And there are systems of calendar division. I think even I've seen an Indian text where they use a 360-degree day year to measure dashas periods. Have you seen that?
360 days.
Yeah, there's a name for it, which I forget, but I've seen in some Indian texts that I've looked at.
Okay.
Some people use the tropical year, some people use the sidereal year, and some people use 360 days per year to measure the dashas.
Okay, but I think, no, I mean, I've never used it with 360 days a year. I always
Right. No, I haven't used it, I've just seen it, I think.
Oh, okay.
And that idea may have come from the Greek text that they inherited.
Okay.
Now, Ptolemy says that he thinks maybe Hipparchus made the conversion from the Babylonian calendar to the Egyptian calendar. And the idea was Hipparchus and Ptolemy wanted a much simpler way. They didn't want some years are 13 months, some years are 12 months, some months are 29 days, some are 30 days. So Hipparchus may be the one who standardized months to be 30 days. This idealized standardized month is 30 days long. And there are 12 of them in a year. So the year is 360 days. There's those 5 extra days which the Egyptians used to celebrate and pray and have festivals.
Okay.
And then the new year started another 360 days. And that parallels the idealized circle of 360 degrees with 12 divisions of 30 degrees in each division. And I suspect this is the idea that got imposed on astrology to make 12 equal signs of the zodiac.
Perfect.
This is just a discussion of the known. This is a book that I read many years ago when I was learning astrology. Margaret Hone, a famous textbook in English. It's probably out of print now, I don't know.
Oh.
But she discusses the NonAdjustable, and she says, this is from page 283 of her book. The degree of the ecliptic cut by the meridian, upper meridian, has been stressed in importance because it is a point of culmination that any degree reaches at its highest point in the day. Meaning that the MC at the moment the chart is drawn may not be the highest point, but as the day progresses, the point that started at the ascendant will eventually get to the MC, and when it does, it will be the highest point in the sky.
Sure.
There's an equally important fact that's not been realized, which is that the NonAdjustable, that was point 90 degrees from the ascendant on the ecliptic, forming the cusp of the 10th equal house, is at any time of the day the highest degree in the heavens. So at the moment the chart is drawn, this nonadjustable 90 degrees between the ascendant and descendant on the ecliptic is the highest point. So we have two highest points. We have the highest point when the chart is drawn, the nonadjustable, and the highest point when the degree rising reaches the midheaven.
Okay.
And I think the ancients, this is my supposition, ancient astrology, realizing that there were two highest points, and being the highest was really important in Persian culture and in Greek culture and Hellenistic culture, Egyptian culture. Being the highest was really important. And how are we going to deal with the fact that there are two highest points in astrology? Well, we create two types of house systems, right? Whole signs and quadrant houses.
Quadrants.
That's my speculation.
Okay.
And this is just showing what I just said. So here's our diagram again. The non-adjustable is 90 degrees from the ascendant. It's here, the 028 Aries, and the MC is there, the Meridian crosses the ecliptic. And here is this here? No, here's Aries over here, the Aries point. Okay.
Aries.
This is again, well, I think I drew this here with the horizon more like it would look. It's more of a curved line, not a flat line.
Sure.
See more clearly here, the highest point is sort of the midpoint in space.
Yeah.
And here's the meridian. The meridian is clearly below the highest point at the moment the chart is drawn. But when the sun gets to the meridian here, it will be the highest point in the sky. So we have two highest points.
Yeah.
All right.
Perfect.
And I threw the equator in here so you can see where the equator crosses the ecliptic.
Ecliptic.
We have this Aries point, or the vernal point. All right. This is more the same diagram, just shown differently. Here's the 90 degrees. And so in whole signs, this highest point becomes, I don't know if anyone uses the non-adjustable as a point, because in whole signs, if a point is in a house, then the whole house takes on that significance.
Yeah, and again here, as we spoke, Mars becomes increasingly a significant factor because it's close to that point where it becomes the highest. Yeah.
And literally Mars at the moment of the chart is the highest planet in the chart. So because it's so elevated, it takes on significance. This is just saying the same. So I just did a blow up of, here's Mars, here's the highest point, here's the MC. So you can see very closely. And this is from the movie The King and I don't know if you ever saw it, but there's a scene in there, and this was true in Persia, because I remember reading a biography of Alexander the Great where he conquers Persia and he realizes the Persian king has this rule that no one's head can ever be held higher than the king's. So if the king sits down, everybody has to immediately go down so their head is below the level of the king's head. And there's a scene in this movie where Yul Brynner hires the teacher and he tells her, your head always has to be lower than mine. Because I'm the king, my head, no one's head shall be higher than the king's. And so there was this principle in the culture that whatever was highest was kingly, had the power and command.
Yeah.
And so then there's this dilemma in astrology. Well, sometimes the MC is highest, sometimes the non-adjustable is highest. Which do we choose, or can we integrate the two ideas?
It's again a controversial.
Yeah. Okay. And this is what I just said, which is more significant, a representative royalty and power, the non-adjustable or the MC. So here's Porphyry. This is the same chart right around sunrise, summer solstice, New York City. And Porphyry just took the arc from the ascendant to the midheaven, divided by 3, I hope I did the arithmetic right. When I
Okay.
divide by 3, I get 37 minutes, 52 seconds. I mean, 37 degrees, 52 minutes.
52 minutes, yeah.
And so each of these houses is exactly 37 degrees, 52 minutes wide. But the problem is that Aries will rise faster than Taurus.
Yeah.
And so they won't encompass the same amount of space. I think I put the,
Criticism.
okay, I said this already. Here's the ascensional times. So in New York, the essential time of Aries is about 17 and the Taurus is 21. So there's already a difference. These are the number of degrees that rise in a essential time. How long it takes the degree to pass over the midheaven for the sign to rise on the ascendant. As you can see, Aries rises pretty quickly when we get down here to Gemini, Cancer. And in the chart we just looked at, it's really Gemini rising. This has a fairly long ascensional time, almost 2 hours. And then when we get into the signs of long ascension, it's even longer. So that the point I'm making simply is that Porphyry, by dividing simply space, is not accounting for ascensional times. They're different for each sign. And what do I say here? Looking at the space in the ascendant to the MC, this space in here. Gemini, Taurus, Aries, and Pisces are signs of short ascension.
Which rise rapidly.
Pisces, Aries, Taurus, Gemini. So they're going to rise rapidly.
Quickly, yeah, okay.
Whereas down here, this space from the ascendant to the IC, which is here, Cancer, Leo, and a little bit of Virgo are going to take a long time to rise, which we can see here. Cancer, Leo, a little bit of Virgo, 35, 38, and a little bit of 37 are going to take as much time to rise as 1, 2, 3, 4 signs of short ascension. And so somehow house systems have to take into account the different ascensional times, rising times of the signs. Alcabitius, well, he said, let's take the distance from the ascendant to the MC. It'll take a certain amount of time for the sun to get from here to here. We already calculated that was what, 14 hours and 55 minutes, 59 minutes. I forget, 57 minutes.
14 hours and 54 minutes.
54 minutes. So let's just divide that by 3, and we got the 2 hours and something. So each of these will be 2 hours and something long. And how do we get the cusps of the Porphyry houses, the Alcabitius houses? Well, it's a very neat, I like his system.
Okay.
So here's his logic. He said, well, we divide these 3 segments by time. And I forget, what did we say? It was 2 hours and
I think it's
14 hours
1 hour
and 54 minutes divided by 3. So each
1 hour 40 minutes or something.
Each is 4 hours and 58 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah.
If I did my math right, my calculator here. So
yeah, you mean dividing those 3 parts. Yeah. Okay, fine.
When the sun has traveled 4 hours and 58 minutes. Yeah, because it's almost 15 hours from here to here. So each of these is almost 5 hours long. So when the sun has traveled about 5 hours, it should be around here. This point, whatever it is, it's not going to be 17 Aries. The cusp here, after almost 5 hours, is going to be pushed to the midheaven. You see that?
Yeah.
So if we recast the chart for a third of the time later, whatever the cusp of the 11th house is will now be the degree of the midheaven. This is Alcabitius' idea. Is that clear or not?
No, I think you can just come again in terms of how it shifts.
Okay, so Alcabisha said, let's take the time for the sun or whatever's here to go from the ascendant to the midheaven. And for the sake of argument, let's say it's 15 hours. It's almost 15 hours this day. 15 divided by 3 is 5 hours.
Sure.
So every time the sun moves 5 hours, one of these cusps moves from
It's
where
going,
it is
yeah, it's going to move, yes, for
to
sure.
here. 5 hours later, this cusp will be here.
Moves there, yeah.
And 10 hours later, this cusp will be here.
Mm.
So to calculate the cusps of these two houses, we just recast the chart for 5 hours later, and whatever's on the midheaven is going to be the cusp of this house.
Sure.
And 10 hours later, whatever is on the midheaven will be the cusp of this house, because 10 hours later, this will move to here.
Yeah.
It's a neat system. I like his thing. And this is what was
Awesome.
done for hundreds of years. So I think I did the math. Oh, so I have it here. So 12 hours, 56 minutes. I calculated exactly. The intervals are 9. Forget my 5 hours is wrong. He's dividing the semi-arc, which was 7 hours, 26 minutes. When you divide the semi-arc, so what I said earlier, I had doubled the figures. This is accurate because I did it. From here to here, from horizon to meridian, will take 7 hours, 26 minutes. If we divide this 7 hours, 26 minutes by 3, each house is going to be 2 hours, 28 or 29 minutes roughly. So if we recast the chart for 2 hours, 29 minutes later, the 11th cusp will be on the midheaven. And if we double that, the 12th cusp will be on the midheaven. So I did that. Next slide.
Sure.
So we started 5:30 in the morning. 2 hours, 29 minutes later, we're at 7:59. And look what's on the midheaven, 7:15.
Yeah.
We go back. Whoops. Here's the original chart. 7 Aries 15 is on the 11th cusp when we start at 5:30. 2 hours, 29 minutes later, 7 hours, 15 is on the midheaven. And guess what's going to be there 2 hours and 20 minutes later? Probably 25 Taurus, 32. Let's see. So they're here at 10:27, 25 Taurus, 32. So it's very simple to calculate the intermediate cusps. You just take the time, divide by 3, advance the chart exactly that amount, and read the cusp off the midheaven. Alcabishus.
Excellent.
So it's a neat system, easy to calculate.
Yeah, I think this is the most easiest so far. Yeah.
Well, Porphyry is the easiest because you just take the 2 values and divide by 3.
Okay.
Porphyry is the easiest. This is the second easiest, I think. That's just an old figure. Okay. Oh, this is a great article on houses. And I've used a couple of his diagrams, but this is worth reading. Graham Bates, Astronomy of Houses by Urania Trust. You can Google it. It's short, it's to the point, a little dense, but I think if you watch this video, it'll be very clear what he's talking about. But I highly recommend this article.
Okay.
Campanus. We already talked some about Campanus.
Sorry?
This is Campanus, how he basically took the prime vertical, divided into 30-degree segments, drew those great circles to the north and south points of the horizon to divide the wedges up, and got these cusps on the ecliptic. And we saw this diagram before. Here's the prime vertical the man is standing in. So Campanus is saying, let's divide these into 30-degree segments and then draw lines from the south point, great circles, to the north point of the horizon. And we're through these 30-degree segments, so we'll have equal wedges around the person on the prime vertical. And wherever they cut the ecliptic will be the cusps of the Campanus houses. Was that clear? Did I go too fast?
Perfect.
Okay. This is a busier diagram, but it's the same idea.
Okay.
Here's the prime vertical. Here's the north and south points of the horizon. And he's going to divide the prime vertical into 30 segments and draw these great circles through those segments. And wherever they cut the ecliptic will be Campana's houses.
Campana's formula.
The rationale. Campanus noted the meridian horizon divided the prime vertical into 4 equal quadrants. He trisected each quadrant into 3 equal parts and then drew great circles to the north and south points of the horizon. His goal was that each house would enclose an equal volume of space, which he accomplished. Oh, this is what we just said. This maybe, so here again is the prime vertical, which he divides into equal segments, draws these great circles from north to south on the horizon. And wherever they cut the ecliptic, which is this red line, the cusp of the 10th house, the cusp of the 11th house, the cusp of the 12th house, the cusp of the ascendant, you can see each wedge is the same amount of space, but they cut the ecliptic at different points. These are the Campana's houses. Okay. All right. Try this at your own risk. Oh, this is from the Graham Bates article. I thought it was interesting. He says, John Addy, who founded Urania Trust, favored Campana's houses. He used them to predict winners of horse races.
Oh.
At the start of the race, he would calculate a chart at the start of the race and then advance the chart slowly to see which planet the advancing Campana's 5th cusp, was 5th is gambling and risk-taking, would aspect first. And he used the symbolism of that planet to pick the winning horse.
Oh.
I have no idea if this works, but say you had a chart where, I don't know, you have Mars is at, say, 15 of a sign, and the Campana's 5th cusp is maybe at 13 of a sign, and then you advance the chart, and the first aspect, the 5th house cusp, forms as to that Mars, and there's a horse that's named, Red Warrior. You pick that horse to win.
Okay. But yeah,
I try to say your own risk because it's an interesting idea. But John Addy was quite an accomplished astrologer. But
okay.
I'd be afraid to try this. Okay. Regiomontanus, same idea as Campanus. He simply divided the equator into 30-degree segments instead of the prime vertical, drew the same lines to project it onto the ecliptic, and got his houses. So he felt that the daily rotation of the Earth on its axis made the equator a more fundamental circle, because it has more to do with mundane events, the actual equator and rotation on the axis of the Earth. Because the rotation of the Earth is responsible for the entire diurnal cycle, which gives us houses. And so this is from the Bates article. He divides not the prime vertical, but the equator into equal 30-degree segments, draws these great circles on the horizon from the south to the north points, and wherever they cut the ecliptic are the cusps of the Regiomontanus. So the 10th cusp, 11th cusp, 12th cusp, ascendant. Similar idea, different great circle. And it produces houses of equal spatial dimensions.
Okay.
Okay. And this just says what I said. Okay. This is from Deb Holding's book on houses. She did a very nice book on houses. And she has a great diagram. I modified it a little because in her diagram, she has noon up here, but in reality, the MC does not occur at noon. It occurs in the middle of the day, which is sometimes noon at the clock, but most of the time it's before or afternoon, when the sun reaches that midpoint in time between sunrise and sunset. But as you can see in her diagram, every 2 planetary hours defines a Placidian cusp.
Oh.
Very simple idea, very elegant idea. The math is a little difficult, but the idea is very simple.
Sure.
And this takes into account ascensional times, the fact that different signs rise at different rates. And okay. But this is basically what Placidus houses are about.
Is this the book, The Houses, Temples of the Sky?
Yeah, houses, temples of the sky, I think it's called. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right here. She has a site called Temples, and this is from chapter 8 of the Temples book.
Okay.
And so Placidus houses, again, we get different cusps, and each of these is 2 planetary hours. So the nice thing is if you know the time of day, you kind of know where the houses are. Like
Sure.
mid-morning, the sun will be in the 11th house because it's 3 to 4 planetary hours into the day.
Mm.
The day shifts at hour 13, so if it's just before sunset, you know you're in the 7th house, in the latter part of this part of the 7th house, because you're in the 12th hour of the day. Okay. This is the passage from Ptolemy that led to so much confusion and discussion for centuries. He was talking really here about length of life and determining whether 2 planets were aligned or not in his system. He said, place is similar and the same if it has the same position in the same direction with reference to both the horizon and the meridian, whatever that means. And Regiomontanus thought it meant one thing, Ptolemy Placidus thought it meant another thing. It becomes a little clear in the second part of the quote. This is the same quote. This is most nearly true of those which lie upon a semicircle described through a section of the meridian or horizon, meaning in a quadrant. Each quadrant at the same position, in each quadrant, the same position makes nearly the same temporal hour. So again, this idea of planetary hours. This diagram is a little busy, but I think it explains it more clearly. This is not the chart we're looking at, but here in this one, the sun rises from the horizon to the meridian in 8 hours and 32 minutes. If we look at Jupiter, it rises in 7 hours and 28 minutes. So they have different semi-arcs. The sun takes longer to culminate than Jupiter does. So how do we know when Jupiter aligns with the sun? And Ptolemy and Placidus both said, when the sun and Jupiter are proportionately the same distance along their semi-arcs, we call them conjunct or in alignment.
Awesome.
And so here we're in the diagram saying, if Jupiter is 3/5 along its semi-arc here, and the sun is 3/5 along its semi-arc here, that's when they align. And this is the basis of Ptolemaic primary directions, and also became the basis of Placidus's house system, because he was trying to make houses that did the same.
Okay.
Why did I put this in here? Okay, each planet has its own rise and set time. This is the chart we were looking at. I just want to show the rise and set times in that solstice chart. The sun rose at 5:30, it sets at 20:25. The moon will rise at 5:40 and set at 21:03 later. And if we look at it, let's take Venus, rise at 4 in the morning, it sets at 18. So the entire day, quote, Venus day in the system is only 14 hours long.
14 hours.
And each planet has its own. Okay. And we talked about this, Alcabitius versus, well, as with Alcabitius, Placidus finds the amount of time it takes for each degree of ascendant to reach the midheaven, which is its semi-arc. But unlike Alcabitius, Placidus divides by 3 to determine when the original ascendant degree will be on the 12th and 11th cusps.
Okay.
Whereas Alcabitius used it to find out when the cusp would move to the midheaven.
Midheaven, yeah.
So that they're sort of looking at the same amount of time, but thinking about it differently.
Mm.
The Placidus, unlike Alcabitius, in the Placidus system, we do not calculate the position of the cusp for the time of the natal chart. We calculate the time of the chart in which the position will be on the cusp. So they're sort of looking at it from different angles. And Placidus modeled this after Ptolemy. And what did I do here? We have 028 Cancer on the ascendant at 5:30 in the morning. And we know it takes 7 hours, 26 minutes to get to the midheaven. Placidus argued that 028 Cancer was on the ascendant at 5:30, that it must be on the 12th cusp at 2 planetary hours later, whereas Alcabitius was arguing that 2 planetary hours later, this cusp moved to the midheaven. Placidus is arguing that this point moves to the 12th cusp. So you see how they're looking at it differently?
Yeah.
But doing that, he's able to construct a table of houses, because if you simply have to move by planetary hours and you make a list, we know at 12:56 in the afternoon that ascending degree would be at the midheaven. 2 planetary hours earlier, it would be on the 11th cusp. 2 planetary hours earlier, it would be on the 12th cusp. 2 planetary hours earlier, it would be on the ascendant. And if you do this like in an Excel spreadsheet, you can make a list of Placidus houses without doing any fancy spherical trigonometry.
Yeah.
It's very easy to create a table of Placidus houses simply by moving the chart by planetary hours. And then you can interpolate from the table of houses for any chart you want to work with at any latitude.
Nice.
And so this may be another reason Placidus became popular, because it became really, really easy to produce his houses, although for a specific chart to calculate those cusps is quite complex.
Okay.
Okay, so that's all I have to say. So let me stop sharing. I hope this makes it clear and not as
I think
less confusing.
No, for sure. I think it's. I mean, I'm just blown away, because for someone like me who never has any exposure to quadrant system, I think my foundation is already set. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that brings us to the end of the video. And I don't think there is any material that's directly available in video form of the rationale for house division. So I think it's, one of the first videos that's available on the internet. So I hope
it's helpful. I was trying to, some of it is my speculation, so I hope that was clear, and some of it's just historical, factual. And the issue is, I think, astrologers, they were trying to reconcile their theory with their practice, and they were noticing, like, they had a belief that whole signs are equal, so all house systems should represent sort of equal division of space and time.
Okay.
And then they attempted to do that, and some did it better than others, and people are still attempting to do it. And then with regard to whole sign versus quadrant, they kept observing that this point called the midheaven, the MC, was so powerful and so important, and had so much in common with the whole sign 10th house, but often appeared in a different house or a different sign. They had, how do we reconcile this? I don't think they've done it yet. Everyone has to sort of judge. And then in terms of houses, is there a best house? I don't think so. I mean,
and whatever works.
That I think you judge empirically. You use a house system, and if it works well most of the time, that's good. And Regiomontanus, I think, was thinking, if you're doing mundane work, world events, things that are universal, maybe using the equator makes more sense. But maybe for something more individual, Campanus makes more sense because it's focused really what's around the specific individual at a precise point in time and place on Earth. And so maybe for psychological astrology, that makes more sense because it's much more particular to an individual's birthplace.
Sure.
Whereas for something horary or mundane, maybe Regiomontanus does make more sense theoretically because it has to do with the equator and the whole rotation of the Earth, creating day and night. So maybe there is no best house system. And
I mean, it's up to the astrologers to kind of choose whatever suits them or suits their way of doing astrology. So,
but I think it started with first defining the zodiac and dividing it into 12 equal segments as a mathematical model for the sky, and then applying that model to houses. Well, if the zodiac is divided into 12 equal parts mathematically in our model, then maybe when we work with houses or places, we should divide those equally as well. And then running into this problem with the midheaven, what do you do with this MC thing? And how do you make sense of that?
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of directly ties into the planetary hours. And I like that idea because planetary hours is not usually dealt with as much as it needs to be. So the idea that there is a lot of mathematical logic that involves planetary hours into the division of house system is kind of extremely significant.
Well, that's the reason I like Placidus a lot. I use Placidus a lot. That he basically is, I think, pre-Einsteinian. He's thinking it's not just space, it's not just time, it's both. And how do we divide up the world around us so that we get equal amounts of time or roughly equal amounts of space-time in each house.
Okay.
Not pure space, not pure time, but space-time.
Space, yeah, sure. Perfect. So, yeah, I think that brings us to the end of this video, and thanks so much for joining, and see you next time.
Okay, great.